Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're here to talk about the Estrelica.Core, as you know already. So I'll talk a little bit about the business benefit, but first off, I just want to introduce my two colleagues who are on the phone. So Scott Taylor, who's the architect of this magnificent beast. So Scott, maybe a quick introduction of yourself, if you would.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I'm a longtime Archer developer, Archer integration developer, and have tons and tons of experience doing this kind of thing. So I've wrapped all that experience up into this product so that other people can enjoy and benefit from my struggles.
And Pete Martin.
Hey, so I'm the Archer implementation lead here at Castle Risk, and yeah, been building and supporting Archer applications for going on a decade now.
Excellent. Thanks, gentlemen. So Estrelica.Core, just a little bit briefly about the business benefit and background, and then we'll get into the more interesting things by actually diving into some of the documentation about it, the code itself, some examples that are teed up within the software and are part of the package that you would get when you download the software itself from NuGet or from our site. More about all that stuff later. But really, fundamentally, it's about making integration with Archer simple, right? So it's, as Scott mentioned, it's all of those experiences that we've had over the years trying to do large scale integrations with the Archer framework, right? So external systems interacting with Archer, being able to do that in a way that's very simple, but also without the level of knowledge that's typically required for somebody to be able to go in and actually understand how an application is built in Archer, how all of that information gets extracted, all the metadata information, reacting to the changes that happen on a regular basis within the application, really industrializing that capability overall. And so Estrelica.Core is really that first and foremost, it's all about that integration or the capabilities and making it simple for a non-specialized developer. So any average .NET developer who can come in and actually use the Estrelica.Core without all of that mystic knowledge about the Archer platform itself. Secondly, it's fully compatible. So this is something which, again, it's about external tools integrating with Archer. We're going to show a demonstration, a number of different demonstrations about different ways this could happen. But it's really about that ability to go from outside in to Archer and to leverage the application and interact with it overall. And we'll talk about some of those pieces. And then the last part is that it's industrial strength, right? So it's not just about the ability to do this at a scale and do this with your factory of development team, but it's also about the fact that you can do really complicated applications that interact or either with Archer or with other tools through the Estrelica.Core, right? So you don't have to sort of limit yourself to just doing some basic activities. You don't have to limit yourself from that perspective. So with that, insufficient intro, I'm going to turn it over to Scott Taylor and let Scott go through the application itself, get into the weeds. This is intended to be a technical conversation. So we have a Q&A available on the YouTube channel, so you can enter questions. They'll get filtered back over to me, and we'll talk through those questions later in the activity. As I say, the program later in the activity, and that's how we'll just make sure that we have some interaction towards the end of this. But first, Scott, why don't you take us through the application, documentation, all those pieces?
Okay, sure. Let me do a quick screen share here, and I will bring up the documentation. This will give some context to some of the things I'm going to talk about. And so this documentation is part of the public solution that we'll talk about coming up here. So you'll be able to refer to this to find everything you'd ever want to know about the core. But at the heart of it really is this the API Facade class. And what that is, it's a thin wrapper around all of the API methods that Archer exposes. Archer has two primary APIs, the classic web services SOAP API, and then the REST API that has been in the product for since somewhere in the 5x range. But between the two of those, they cover the majority of the things that anybody would ever want to do with Archer, with some gaps, understandable gaps in there. There are, and that those gaps demonstrate themselves in a variety of ways. Some are cases where certain items just are not available through the APIs at all. A classic example of that is solutions. You would think solutions being kind of fundamental to the overall object model on the Archer side, that you would be able to query for solutions through the APIs, but There's no mention of solutions at all in any of the API documentation, if you've had a look at that. And then likewise, there's some cases like fields. If you have a calculated field, the system will tell you indeed that that field is calculated. It won't tell you what the formula is for that calculation, however. And so little gaps like that, and beyond the gaps, there are some quirks of behavior where certain methods that you would think would behave identically based on, or behave similarly based on their structure and calling conventions, they in fact do not. And these are just little problems that you only discover after you've really dug into it and had plenty of experience working with the APIs. And a lot of times those discoveries don't come until your code is 2 months into production, and then you have problems to deal with that you didn't see coming. So all of those kinds of experiences like that I'm talking about, that I've gone through over 16 years now of doing integration development with the Archer platform, both as an internal, as an employee of Archer. I actually started back in 2005 as the manager of the integration team internally, and then spun out later to start doing independent consulting, doing integration. And it was that transition really that led to a lot of this discovery. When I was working there at Archer, a lot of the integration work that I did, I had the luxury, and my team had the luxury of being able to code directly against the Archer framework classes directly. We didn't really use the public APIs much, frankly. So we were frankly kind of ignorant of just how bad it was for people on the other side of the wire there. It wasn't until I got out in the real world and started getting called in by former customers who learned that I was no longer an employee of RSA, saying, hey, can you come in and help us do this integration? We're having trouble making this work and making that work. And I'd say, okay, sure. And before I knew it, I was doing that full time again. But I learned through those experiences that it's not for the faint of heart. It's not simple. And so that's where a lot of those gaps and quirks of the system, that's where I discovered a lot of those. And
so this is the deluxe version, Scott?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
This is taking all of that knowledge that I've acquired through those experiences and packed it into what is now the Estrelica.Core, so that other people don't have to go through that same level of pain and the learning process. But more than that, this again, talking about just the API Facade class at this point, this is a wrapper around those API methods that handle some of those quirks and discrepancies, as well as if extensions are available to the core, which is in the professional and enterprise versions of the software, it will fill in those gaps I talked about for things like solutions. It introduces new API methods to get things like solutions or data feeds or statistics reports. You know, there are several things. Actually, there's a list here I can show. A lot of things that are not available through Archer's APIs that the Estrelica.Core can provide if it has those extensions available. But beyond that, the API Facade is really not the most critical part of all of this. The Estrelica.Core has a set of resolver classes that in turn, just like the API Facade wraps the Archer APIs, the resolver classes wrap the API Facade to make sense of the results that are coming back out of that. Anybody on the call who's ever dealt with Archer's APIs or just REST APIs in general, I guess, you know how they're typically just spitting back a bunch of JSON data, strings coming back from the HTTP response, and you're responsible for deserializing that and making sense of what is actually contained in those objects, in those JSON strings. So that's one thing that the API Facade does, is it handles that deserialization and returns everything as either dictionaries of string dynamics in the case of individual items, or enumerables in the case of sets of those items. But what and if you're comfortable working with those, if you, what comes out of that, of course, is a set of essentially key value pairs. So you request a field, for example, you'll get a dictionary of string dynamic where the key will have all the property names for a given field. And if you're familiar with those and you know what the property names are, you can stop right there and work directly with the API facade. But that's part of that tribal knowledge that Tim talked about, that just knowing what the keys are for all the dozens upon dozens of entities that exist in the Archer framework, that only comes from experience or by evaluating the data that comes back and learning what's in those dictionaries. So one of the primary advantages that the Estrelica.Core provides are these resolver classes I mentioned. What those do, they take those dictionaries and wrap those in strongly typed .NET objects. So now instead of having these strings that you have to query of a dictionary, instead you get classes that actually have truly dotted properties that you can access. And the advantage of that, of course, is that if you're trying to access things by strings, the compiler is not going to stop you from mistyping something. Maybe this is case sensitive, and that you accidentally use a lowercase t to access field type. Compiler is going to let that go right through, and you're not going to find out until it actually executes that something is broken when the value you expected in the dictionary isn't there. Instead, using these strongly typed classes, all of that is accessible by dotted properties, and by virtue of that, the compiler will enforce that you're actually spelling things correctly, and furthermore, IntelliSense will help you find the things that you need from those objects. I want to be clear, though, that these are not just simple deserialization classes. We're not just taking the JSON libraries and pumping things into a bunch of classes that I've built. Instead, these are really wrappers around those dictionaries. And what that does is it still allows you, even on the results that come back from the resolvers, even though they're strongly typed, they still implement that iDictionary string dynamic interface. So you can still use this convention if you choose to. And that's useful for cases where you have like mappings that are defined in an XML file or something, and you want to use those mappings as strings to go find the corresponding property values in the objects coming back from Archer. But you're certainly not required to do that, given that it has full properties for those. And again, the properties themselves are strongly typed as well. So it simplifies things in that way by wrapping things with those classes. Another thing that it does, the resolver classes in general that they do, is that they handle caching, so that if you ask for the same field 30 times through the API facade, it's literally going to make 30 separate HTTP calls to the Archer APIs for that. If you ask for that same field 30 times through the resolver, however, it will cache it on the first fetch and then return that same result on subsequent calls. And that cache lifetime is fully controllable. You can flush the cache at any time. If you want to force it to reload things, you can adjust the timeout of each of the resolver caches. All of that's completely within your control. Then the third thing that they do, and this is where the real magic comes in, more than just representing these individual objects that come back, like a field or a level or a module or a data feed or any of those sorts of things as discrete individual objects, it actually returns these more as an object graph. So like take, for example, module. A module has levels in Archer. Once you've pulled down the module through the API, you can iterate through it, find out what its ID is, and then call another API method to say, okay, now give me the levels for that module. And it'll spit back an enumeration of these dictionaries of each of the individual levels. And then you can find the level you want in that list, pick out its ID, and then call back to the API to say, now give me the fields, give me all the field definitions for this level ID. you can do it that way if you choose. But what the resolver classes do is they actually, in those intelligent objects they return, for those linkages like that, where there is a relationship between two of these entity types in Archer, it also adds dotted property accessors for those relationships. So in the case of that example I just mentioned, really all you'd need to do for that to get to the fields for a given module is just get the module object called .levels, find the level within that set that you want, and on that level object called .fields, just like that. No need to make any API calls yourself. It's all happening in the background, and it's happening on demand too. It's not, we don't hydrate the entire object graph with everything that's in Archer on the first call. It's just selectively making those calls in the background as the properties themselves are accessed to go in and hydrate the objects that are needed at that point in your code. So it's super efficient, and it alleviates a lot of the again, like Tim mentioned, the need for knowledge. What API method do I need to call to load levels for a given module? What API method do I need to call to load the fields for a given level? You don't need to know any of that anymore. It's all just a matter of hitting those properties on the objects that get returned. One other thing that the API, yeah.
Sorry, let me just, because I did fail to mention that, right? Because you've really made an important point, which is that when we talk about this being or creating greater efficiencies for somebody developing in Archer, right? Those integrations, all those things you just talked about are really what are going to give somebody the massive uplift, as opposed to, yes, we've wrapped this in a more simplistic view, we've filled some gaps, but it's really all of these additional functions that we've built into the tool that are actually what are going to give the greatest value long term for somebody in those deep integration opportunities, those deep complexity opportunities, right?
Exactly. And thank you for putting that into sales speak rather than nerd speak, the way I've been talking.
That's what we're here for.
But you make a good point. Exactly. I'm here to cover the technical side of this, but Tim will tell you why it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. But one thing I glossed over in talking about the API Facade, one other thing it does, and again, this will be something that hopefully a lot of the people on the call are familiar with. If you've dealt with the Archer APIs before, they return a lot of integer IDs with no context of what those IDs mean. Like for the field definitions, there will be a type value in there that specifies what the field type is. And there are, I think, 20 odd field types in Archer, but all you get back in that property is just an integer, 1, 2, 3, et cetera, all the way up to the high end ones are like 1,000 and 1,001. So you have to know as a developer, what is field type ID for? That I don't know it off the top of my head. I used to, because I dealt with it so much, but now that I've got the Estrelica.Core, I've cleared that section of my brain out, so I don't need to think about it anymore. What the API Facade does is for those type IDs, and there are dozens of those again throughout the object model, it converts those into actual .NET enumerations, so that rather than doing this kind of evaluation where when you're looking at a module's metadata, figuring out that, okay, this is module type 2, instead, you can evaluate it with those enumerations like this. It's a module type .questionnaire. And furthermore, on those those intelligent classes I mentioned, like the module class, when it returns its module type property, it is typed to this module type enumeration. So in code, the IntelliSense will let you know when you're evaluating that property, these, whatever the 3 values, I guess, for a module type, it'll let you know what those 3 options are, either applications, questionnaires, or subforms. And then similarly for fields, it will show you what all the options are: text, data, numeric, or text, date, numeric, cross-ref, related records, etc. All those field types are represented through those enumerations. And then furthermore, even in the case of fields, the individual field types themselves each have a specific representation as a concrete class, all represented via interface in terms of what comes out through the core. So taking this as an example here, here's a way if you were tasked with trying to find all the calculated values list fields in level 1, 2, 3, you could do it this way if you chose. Call out to the API Facade, call its get field definitions for level method, pass in that level. It's going to return back that set of dictionaries that I talked about. And then you can interrogate each one. If you know that the is calculated key results in a bool that tells you whether the field is calculated or not, and you know that the field type key returns that enumeration that I mentioned that tells you what the field type itself is, then you can code this way to find all of the values list or calculated values list fields in a given level. If you do it through the metadata resolver instead, though, that's where all that intelligence I talked about comes in, as well as the dotted property callback that automatically calls the API for you on the back end. So what's happening here is that this actually returns a level object, and that level object has a fields property that when that enumeration of the fields property is invoked, the resolver knows to go out and make this API call here on your behalf, deserialize the stuff into the results into these dictionaries, and then wrap those dictionaries with the appropriate class for each of the fields that got returned. So what that means is, in this example, doing all of that above, you can do it very simply just like this, by putting on the fields that are returned, putting some where conditions on, saying I want to return only those that are of this type, that they have the required, I'm sorry, that should be calculated. I mistyped that when I put in the example. Imagine this says calculated here. I'll fix that in the documentation shortly. But this is calculated property will reveal the field types that are capable of being calculated. And then from that subset, it will return only those that are a values list field. And then actually I should have included an additional condition here that actually checks to see for that property if the is calculated value for that field is true. So this example is actually not very well written. I could have done this a little better. There's a predicate that I missed in here where I should have checked, F arrow F dot is calculated.
You can go to the real stuff.
The fact that it has okay, yeah, we'll show it there. Anyway, so I'm getting a little deep in the weeds here, but so the documentation itself is all here, and there are some examples here of exactly how to invoke the core, the requirements that validating the license, authenticating with Archer, et cetera, and some quick examples of how to access the different entities in Archer, and then the resolver classes that I mentioned. We have the, oops, let me go back here. Sorry about that. We have the content resolver. That allows you to get content. Everything I've talked about up to this point has been metadata specific, but there's just as much capability having to do with content. Makes it very easy to retrieve content as well as update content and push it back to Archer. There's the layout resolver, which allows you to get layout information out of Archer. And this is another one of those gaps that Archer's API will only allow you to retrieve the default layout for each level. If you use advanced workflow, it will not present any of those alternate layouts at all. But this is one of those gaps that if extensions are available, the core will handle that and will return all of the layouts for a given level. Metadata resolver, we talked about that. That's where you would get things like applications, questionnaires, fields, et cetera. And then report resolver, that's where you would get things like reports and data feeds, and eventually notifications will be included in here. That's yet to be implemented, but all of those things that are associated with reports would be found there. And so I will toggle over, like Tim suggested, to the demos here. Let me pull up Visual Studio. And this is this solution here is will be available on the website, that you can download this and see some examples of how you would do different things. There's one example for metadata, showing how you would pull down, for example, solutions, subforms, that sort of thing, and different cases where if extensions are available or not, how it behaves in those different circumstances. There's another one for content. As mentioned, you can very easily pull content from the core, and it alleviates all the need for, if again, anyone who's done any work with content through the Archer API, specifically if you've used the search methods that are in the classic web services, SOAP services, the requirement for that, one of the parameters that you have to pass in is an XML structure representing the search that you want to perform. It's very similar to what you see on the report. If you're building a report where you select display fields, field criteria for the field conditions, the sort options, all that sort of thing, that XML mirrors that structure. And in fact, what the report engine is doing is essentially running a canned search in the background. So it effectively uses that same XML structure for what it does. It doesn't go through the API necessarily, but hits some of the backend layers right behind the API. So again, to make those kinds of searches, you have to build that search XML, and it's not simple. That's probably one of the most frustrating things I've ever had to deal with in all of the projects I've ever worked on, is just trying to get all the pieces right for that search options XML. It is documented to a degree, but the documentation is lacking in a lot of ways. It certainly doesn't show any clean examples of what the overall document should look like. It shows details of each node that's in the document, but nothing about the context of where it should be located in the overall XML document. So that's there's a lot of learning curve to getting that stuff right. That's one thing that the core takes care of for you. You basically, we're not showing it here in this example. There will be an example in another one coming up, but this method here has a whole series of properties or parameters you can provide it, including things like which fields you want to show there, potentially which IDs. If you know you're searching for a particular ID, you can pass those in this way. And then the filter conditions. This is one of the biggest hang-ups in getting a successful search to work, because Archer, sometimes if you don't get your filter just right, it will ignore the filter altogether and just return every record in the system. And in almost no case, unless you feed it completely malformed XML, in almost no case does the search engine ever raise any intelligible errors that tell you what's wrong with the XML that you've fed it. So again, using this method here will incorporate all of the knowledge that I picked up over the years and help you get through those difficulties in forming the correct search XML. But again, we'll cover that in more depth here in the next demo coming up. So again, there's one to show how to deal with metadata, one to show how to deal with content. There's another here that I call the data feed explorer, that allows you just to kind of look at the data feeds in your system. Excuse me. Look at the data feeds in your system, check the most recent run status for a given data feed, look at its run history, see any errors that occurred, all of that sort of thing. All of that can be done through the API, through the core. Unfortunately, the one thing, a lot of those methods I mentioned are present in the Archer API, but they require a data feed GUID as their key in order to pull the history for a data feed, or to pull the most recent execution stats, all that sort of thing. But the API provides no way for you to discover what the GUIDs are. So that's one of the things that the core extensions, another of those gaps that they fill in. So in order to do anything with data feeds, really, extensions are required. So this app here will, only function, frankly, if the extensions are there, just so that it can do that initial discovery to figure out what data feeds apply to a given level and what are their GUIDs, that sort of thing. That's one of it seems like one of the obvious things that should be in the Archer API, but is not. And then lastly, there's a, we call it the CHUM tool. It's the Castle Hill User Management Tool. And this one is just a very simple way to assert membership in a set of Archer groups for a given user in the Archer Contacts application based on the groups that have been inserted into a particular field in there. It's very simplistic, doesn't have any particular rules around it other than this user needs to be in these X number of groups and no others. So it will make sure that they're added to those groups if they're not already there, and removed from any others that they might already be a member of. Of course, that would break cases where maybe somebody was manually inserted into a group outside the rules of that simple scenario. So for that, we actually have a more robust solution that handles those kinds of cases. And I've implemented an app to process those kinds of changes using an Archer application that Pete has developed. So I'm going to turn it over to Pete now, and I'll stop screen sharing so that he can pull up the user application, or what is it, user access request application in Archer, and demonstrate what that is. So again, I'll stop sharing, and Pete, you can take over.
Hey, Pete, before you get started, just because Scott, you raised a couple of points there. One is that Estrelica.Core in the professional and enterprise version provides extension beyond what you get out of the box from Archer, right? So there are, as you mentioned, those extensions.
Correct.
There's a lot of things that will fill in gaps either in the existing REST or old web services API, like you gave that description about the XML search and just that less documented features, but also access to information that you wouldn't get otherwise without a lot of work. I think the other piece I just wanted to raise again, just to remind folks, those items that you were walking through, those are examples that we're providing as part of this, right? So the Estrelica.Core is the power, that's the engine. Those things that you mentioned aren't the only ways in which you can use Estrelica.Core. Any way that you need to integrate with Archer, the Estrelica.Core is going to be able to help. Those are just some diverse examples of different types of questions that have come up over the 16 years, right, of experience and time that we've all put into the Archer space. And this scenario that we're about to walk through with Pete is another one of those, simple in some ways, but a lot harder to implement without a tool like Estrelica.Core for to have your development team participate in. The level of knowledge required to build this otherwise is much more significant and much more time consuming than doing it with the Estrelica.Core. So sorry, Pete.
Oh, that's all right. All right, so what we're talking about here is a pretty simple user request process from like an Archer workflow perspective. Our scenario here is we have a user, Martin Axelrod, and we're just looking at the Archer user account just for the sort of before picture here. And we have
I thought his name was Chad, Pete.
Not
Okay.
this one.
All right.
So Martin's in the group, the model risk model developer group, and say he's moving to the model risk validation team, right? So we want to get his submit a request and get that approved to switch his access over. And then we're using Estrelica.Core and the script that Scott's built out to actually implement the user access request, right? Because it takes time. It's a pretty timely process and pretty mundane effort to go and actually implement user access requests manually and swapping people between groups, etc. So what we're going to just do is a live demo of that using the core. So we have this User access request form, just a custom ODA, very simple. Oh, sorry, give me a second here. And of course, it's freezing. Sorry about that. It looks like I timed out getting this thing prepped. And so what we're going to do is just submit this request for Martin and do a really quick approval. So this request is to both add and remove access. We're going to request that he gets added to the validator group. And we're going to request that he gets removed from that developer group. And for the request details, request an access change due to his new role. And we'll submit it. And so using advanced workflow here, it's going to get assigned, and I just happen to be Martin's manager for the approval, and we'll approve the request. And so we'll show you one more thing here quick before we pass it back to Scott. We're going to see the status goes from pending manager review to approved not implemented. And down here, we're using a helper field that gets leveraged via advanced workflow for reasons that Scott will show in a little bit. And now that it's approved and not implemented, we just have implemented as no. The default here was NA. And so now we're going to hand it back to Scott and let him show the magic on the Estrelica.Core side and what we're using to actually facilitate making this access change for Martin Axelrod and this user access request. All right. I will stop.
Thanks, Pete. And so this is the user access processor application that I've created using the Estrelica.Core to fulfill those requests that Pete just entered there. So what this is going to do first, we have a few settings here to identify the significant fields that we need to process this request. The application itself, of course, user access request, and then these 4 fields here are where the details of that request are as far as we're concerned. This one will, this is a cross-ref to the contacts application that tells us the user that needs to have the groups added and removed. These 2 fields, of course, as the name shows, the groups that Pete has selected for addition and removal. And then lastly, this is the that values list field that will have no in it for each of the records that are ready to be processed by this application. And of course, as I mentioned, this is a cross-ref to, or I'm sorry, this contacts XREF here. This is a cross-ref over to the contacts application. So we need to go over there as well to get the actual Archer user account where the groups are going to be added and removed. So I'll go ahead and fire that up and we can walk through and see what it does here. Should hit that breakpoint soon. There we go. So it's going to call that metadata.applicationByName method to get the module in question for that UAR application. Then it's going to query it. We know it only has 1 level, so we're just going to pass null as the level identifier. That'll just return the first one it finds. We could have passed a name or alias or GUID here if we wanted to find one more specifically, but in this case, we know it only has 1, so we'll just take what it gives us. And then from that level, we'll go through and identify each of the fields in question. And so, as mentioned before, each of these fields has a specific type. So this method here will ask it, for that level, for its fields, find the one having whatever name I gave you in that variable of this type. And then same goes for each of these. So again, these values coming back here are strongly typed to these types. So we know They'll have the properties and so forth that we need from them. Then what we're doing here, same thing for the contacts application, looking for that field that contains the user that will actually need the update. And then I'm just going to cache those. The contacts application is pretty small, so I'm just going to call into that search to search the contacts level and only return the single field that I care about, that user field. And then I'm going to, for each of those records, and this is where, like I mentioned, that this being strongly typed as a user group list field, when I ask the record for the value of that field, it knows that it's a complex field that has these additional properties on it. In the case of a user group list field, it has a user's property, it has a group's property, etc. And so from that value coming back, I'm just going to say, give me the first user that's on that contact record, or the default, which would be null if there is no attached user. So again, we know that each of the contacts records should have at most one user associated. So this is a simple way to build up a quick dictionary that will let us find for each of the records coming in from the user access request via its crossref, what is the actual user that I should find there. And these are all the users that it loaded there into that cache. So now, moving on, we'll get down here to this. And this is what I talked about before about the filter conditions, that it's not a simple process to code these XML conditions by hand, but each of the field types has a helper method called create condition that you can pass in the operator that you wanted to evaluate and the value that you wanted to evaluate. And then it will build that XML for you. And then those get passed directly into this filter collections or filter conditions collection. In this case, we only have one, so I'm just spinning it up as an array. But any sort of IEnumerable X element that you can come up with to feed into here will satisfy that parameter. So again, we're just basically saying we want to execute a search to only return those records where the implemented field has the value no, and then for those records, we want to return just those 4 fields that we're interested in. And if we do that, we should see it return the records that Pete just entered and approved. And so going through here, first thing we're going to do is look at that context xref field that will return an enumerable of content IDs for that crossref field. So we just want to grab the first one. Again, we know it will only have one, so we're using first or default there. Assuming that it does have a contact record associated, it'll come down here. It'll then look up the user in our cache for that particular contact record. And then it will put that user into edit mode, because first thing we're going to do, or the only thing we're going to do here for this operation, is to add and remove groups from it. So by putting that, calling the .forEdit on the user object, it basically wraps it with an editor that keeps track of the changes that we make, so that when we push it back to Archer, it will only account for those changes. It won't necessarily update the entire object that we pass back, but only the things that are relevant to the changes we've made. So here we're looking in that groups to add field, finding all the groups that are associated with it. If that count is 0, we'll log an error. Otherwise, go ahead and spin through, pull out the IDs and confirm that that user is not already a member of that group. If they are, we'll log that. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and call the user.groupids.add and pass it the new group ID. Then we'll set this value here just to know that something changed. So we need to push an update back to Archer. And then I won't go through it line by line, but we do basically the same thing in reverse for the remove groups. And I'll just let that run down here to where the update happens. Actually, right here where we are. So here, if the group's changed, if we sense that we either added or removed something, it'll call this update method and pass that edited user back in, which will call the Archer API methods to update the user. and set those groups on the user. And then lastly, we're going to edit the record itself. This is the UAR record, and we're going to set that implemented field to yes to indicate that it has been implemented. And then again, similar to this update, we're going to call content update for the record object, push it back, and likewise, that will call the Archer API to push that change back in. And I'll just let it fly for the other records here.
Hey, Scott, just importantly,
And
just importantly, you've never once talked about going into the Archer admin console, looking up a application ID or decomposing the application structure,
true.
right, or any of those things. You've walked us through the logic required to perform the task from an external developer's perspective, right? There's nothing else is happening.
Exactly. As that developer, really, these are the only things I need to know. Just tell me where to find the things that you want me to act on. What are their names? And furthermore, these needn't be names. These could be aliases, could be GUIDs, could be integer IDs, whatever. It's obviously a lot easier to work with names. It helps keep the code readable, but these methods here, like I said, there's one by name, there's a similar by alias, there's by GUID, by ID, etc. So, I'm all about options. I try to make it as easy for anybody to handle it in whatever scenario. But yeah, as far as internal knowledge of Archer goes, that's the extent of it right there. And so now we can verify the results of that. I'll go ahead and pull that Archer instance over. So this is Martin Axelrod's group membership before I made that change. And I believe we were adding him to the model analyst group. Is that correct, Pete?
The validator.
Go ahead and close that out. A validator, okay. Go ahead and close it out and reload it, and we will see. Once it refreshes, we will see that he now is in the model validator group. And then furthermore, we can go back over to the request itself. And actually, I can just show that from the top level view here. Oops, that's not where I meant to go. Sorry, go into this one here. I can show it here that, yes, indeed, those two records that Pete had approved are now implemented.
Ta-da.
And so that's basically it. You can see how simple it is. A lot of this code is boilerplate. A lot of this code is comments. As far as the actual code that requires somebody to think to create an app like this, it's fairly minimal. There's really not a lot happening here. All the heavy lifting is handled by the core. Certainly, you'll notice one thing that's absent here. There's no mention of the APIs themselves. I'm doing everything through that object model. So again, the primary benefit of the core when you go through these resolver classes like the content resolver, metadata resolver, etc., they wrap everything that's in Archer in effectively a virtually hydrated object graph, so that you never need to worry about making API calls again. And that's it. That's pretty much all there is to it.
Hey,
so,
Scott. Scott, before we jump into those other conversations, you don't happen to have the before and after view handy, do you? Just to reinforce that point of what you have to go through.
Yeah, show that real quick. So Tim asked me to do an example of how would you write something with the core versus without the core. If you had to go back in time and work directly against the Archer API itself, how would you do that versus how would you do it today? And I laughed in his face. I said, Tim, there's a reason I created the core, so I would never have to do that again. But he forced me, so I went ahead and implemented this. And this is a contrived example just to demonstrate what I'm talking about here. But imagine the requirement is that somebody wants me to create an app that will go out and find all the text fields in the, I think it's the section level. Is that correct? I've forgotten what I used here as my in the section level of the policies application. And so this is what it would look like as a raw writing straight against the Archer API, a raw application to do that. There are some helper methods here that get reused quite a bit to make the HTTP calls, figure out whether it needs to implement get override or not. There's some variance in the Archer methods, whether they do or not on that. So again, that's some of that tribal knowledge that you only learn by doing. And then some other helper methods here to deserialize those JSON results that come back. And here I'm just simply dumping those into JObjects, Newtonsoft JSON objects here, rather than going straight to dictionaries the way the API Facade does. But again, this is helper methods for that. And then here's the process. Basically, you first have to establish the session. And this is one thing I didn't mention. The API Facade and the core itself actually handle all concerns about the session. You basically give it the credentials and the connection endpoint to your Archer instance. And then when a session is needed, it will take care of making sure that one is established. And if for any reason, say you've got two competing processes that are using the same account and killing one another's sessions as they make their API calls, it will gracefully recognize that its session has been trodden upon and reestablish it transparently before, it will retry the method basically with a fresh session every time that happens. So that situation obviously isn't covered here. I'm trusting that this session that I'm getting here in this session token will stay valid for the length of time that my app is running. If for any reason someone else were to come in and log in with the same account, obviously my session would be canceled and then my code would break. That doesn't happen with the core. All of that is just magically taken care of in the background. But anyway, so that's always step one. Every API call requires a session token. So we'll get that here. And then we'll call this application method here to get all the applications in the system and iterate through those, looking for the one having the name that we've selected, which is policies. Fetch its application ID, break out of that loop, come down here and do the same thing to get the levels for that particular application. Iterate through those, looking for the one named section, and again, capture its ID. Then lastly, come down here, get all the field definitions for that level, and iterate through those, looking for the ones having the type that we mentioned. And like I said, we're looking for text fields. To do it this way, you just have to know that one means text field. There's a list in the Archer documentation. You can also query the Archer database, find them there. But one way or another, if you're doing it this way, you better have this list tacked up on the wall next to your computer so you can reference those as needed. They do come up quite a lot. Or you can use the core and just count on the enumerations to tell you what you need. But anyway, this is for that contrived example, like I mentioned, just going through the section level of policies and finding its text fields, and then outputting the name, obviously. This is what it would amount to. So by comparison, Tim asked me to do the same thing with the Estrelica.Core, and there it is right there. We do still need to establish a session. We do that through this invocation step here. But once that's done, all the rest of it is a single line of code. Just that simple. And so that's the extent of it. That's how we do these kinds of applications. And so if we're ready, if Pete, you don't have any other concerns, then we can move on to the Q&A section. Or did you have something, Pete?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for instance, I'm coming back to the user access request. You mentioned the log files, right? And you're capturing that. What if we wanted to capture that in the system, right? What if the manager identifies, hey, audit needs this information. They want to make sure that what's being processed is tracked, right? What's the process to implement that? So create a new, say we created a field called activity log to capture that. I just did that, put it on the layout. What do we do to, get that
Okay.
as a part of that process?
And so you
manager
have
change the
created
requirements on you?
It's never happened before. But
exactly. So we're having a late breaking requirements change in the middle of my demo, huh? Okay. So tell me again, what's the name of the field?
Activity log. I actually just put it on the layout too.
Okay.
You can show it
And
section.
let me pull that up. Is that, so that's in LGA, is that going to the other environments as well?
Yeah, well, probably, yeah. In this instance, let's say we have to go straight to prod, so we have to do it. It's kind of a rush job to make sure that we're not, we don't.
So
It. Yep.
we won't have it then in the UAT environment then. So just dev and prod. Okay. And so will it have that same name in all the environments? Can I count on that at least?
We'll say for now it's activity log, but we might change it later.
Okay. All right. So we can't trust that the name will stay the same. We don't even know that it necessarily will exist in all of the environments. So what I'm going to do, we are going to deploy this via packaging, correct?
Ideally, right?
Yep. Okay. So at least that's one thing that will stay consistent, even if the name and alias differs between environments. As long as it's deployed by packaging, we can trust that the GUID will stay the same. So I'll use that here. So let's confirm that is a multi-select. Yeah, text area. Okay. So what I'm going to do then is go in here where we've captured all the other fields, and I'll just add another one in here. Activity log field. Good. And we know that's a text field. Just like that. But since we aren't confident that that will necessarily exist in all environments, what these methods will do, they'll provide verification for you. If you give it a name that there is no cross-ref field that exists by that name, this will throw an exception telling you that that identifier is invalid for that particular level. But there's an optional parameter here where I'm going to tell it, no, I don't want you to throw that exception if the identifier is invalid. Instead, just return null to me. So we'll use that for the UAT case where that field may not exist. Then what I'll do here is create a string builder. Need to bring in those, oops, bring in that to the using clause. And very simply, we'll just attach every time we do a log here, I'll just append to it. Like that. And then we'll start by clearing that log, or clearing that string builder, of course, each time. We'll add in this new field as another one that we want to return. And what did I call that? Activity log field? Yeah. Oops. Double equals. Add that in. And then down here where we do the update, after we set the implemented field, I'll just do the same thing for the activity log field. Just like that. Yeah, why is it not liking this? Oh, it's making a fool of me now. What do I? Oh, sorry, it's value in this case. Since that's not a complex type, it doesn't have, it's a basically a simple atomic type. So it doesn't have the complex editor that a values list field does, where you could set other text, you could set multiple values, etc. This one's just a straight value assignment, kind of like a, numeric field, date field, text field. You can just assign those directly this way. So now, so you do have approved records out there that are ready for processing?
Yep. Yeah, there's a couple out
Okay.
there with a couple different scenarios that we'll see that, a couple different logging errors that we should expect to see.
Well, let's just let that fly then. I'll remove some of these breakpoints. We don't need to see all of that happen again. Okay, there we go. We are finding those records. Okay, so there's one of those exceptional conditions. One of the add requests that you requested has already been, that user is already in that group. And one of the removes, the user is not in that group. So there we go. Well, let me throw it back over to you, Pete, to review and see if it did what you wanted.
Yep, just added the field activity log to the report. And you can see that we didn't have the activity log, this process implemented for the earlier requests that were processed. But now we have the activity log entries for these newer requests that were just approved. And it has the detail. This one, it says he's already in that group, so he hasn't, and nothing, there's no request to be removed, so no changes were made, as an example.
Well, there you go. That should have been a 2-week development effort. So I'm taking the afternoon off.
I know we've gone through a lot of these different areas, so I really appreciate it, Scott. I appreciate it, Pete, for that stuff. And I promise I won't change the requirements for 5 more minutes. But the overall, just to sort of round it out, right? So we have a website for the software, castlehillsoftware.com. You can go to Castle Hill Software. For folks who have joined this meeting live, we're also offering a 1/3 discount off of the price of the software as well. So that'll be an offer that'll be coming through email for you as part of joining this inaugural conversation about the Estrelica.Core. The information is, or the software is available a couple different ways, but NuGet, so a straight download that's available for folks to get, with all of the appropriate information from that perspective. And then the last piece is just that, again, there's 3 different versions of the Estrelica.Core, and Scott talked about this or alluded to this before. We have our basic, which is really focused on providing ease of use of the Archer API and some of those functional activities, like making sure you can get to the sessions and other pieces. In professional, where you get the extensions, so you get some of those gaps that we talked about filled from that perspective, and then an enterprise version as well. The enterprise version is more for situations where you have multiple production instances or other types of more complex scenarios from that perspective. I think, Scott, the last piece that I just wanted to maybe get your thoughts on overall is what's the amount of time it's going to take somebody to become familiar with using the Estrelica.Core, right? So I'm Joe developer. I'm a .NET, reasonably okay .NET person coming into this crazy risk management world for the first time. How long is my ramp up time to get up and using the Estrelica.Core and building applications interact with Archer?
Well, there is some assumption of at least an understanding of Archer conceptually. You do need to know that Archer is composed of modules with levels and fields and that sort of thing. But essentially, if you understand that structure, that data model that Archer has on its side, then understanding it through the core and accessing it through the core is I would guess a couple of afternoons, anybody could come up to speed on that.
Yep.
Wouldn't take much time at all.
Yep. And those examples that you've provided give you the different sort of the classic scenarios that you may get into of metadata or content updates or things of that sort.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's one of the things that, you know, the reason for this tool, the reason for this library was that I not only did I implement it just to satisfy my frustration with all those years of fighting against Archer. I did it for, as you know, Tim, but to let the audience know, this is for a very complex system that is all about capturing metadata for historical purposes and trending and tracking and so forth. So yeah, a lot of the focus in the core is certainly around metadata, but we also, through a similar application, have the ability to capture content that way as well. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question directly, but it definitely covers those two subject areas.
Right. Yep. I mean, the key point is that this is going to dramatically decrease the onboarding time for somebody to build an application, right? So it's not about somebody becoming familiar with Archer and how to build applications in Archer. It's just some core concepts that they could get quickly, and then it's whatever your business problem is, right? Solve the business
Exactly.
problem, and make that part of it go away in a more
Yeah,
efficient way.
that's really the intent. That you know, in a classic scenario, you have to have developers who understand not only the business that you're running, but also these details about how to work with Archer. So the idea here, and those are admittedly going to be rare people. You know, there are some superstars who can balance both sides of that really well. I'm not one of them. I've worked in a lot of business on a lot of projects for a lot of businesses where I was the Archer superstar, but was only vaguely aware of a lot of the business processes that I was being tasked with implementing. So this makes it so that you need just the opposite of that. You can have people who are very familiar with your business and the business rules and the processes that your business needs to keep running, but have virtually no experience or knowledge of Archer to get that stuff done within the Archer framework.
Yeah, we've certainly seen those instances where we've had to pull data from applications, process mapping applications, from asset management applications, from cyber surveillance type of applications, and work on that data, bring it to a conclusion, right? Actually doing that outside of those applications as well, doing comparisons against other data and other information, really complicated scenarios, where to try to do that through some crazy combination of data feeds or in application type of things inside of Archer is prohibitive from a performance and capabilities perspective. And this just opens up the entire world of development to interacting with Archer in a whole different way. So it's really, really powerful from a architecture, from a business architecture perspective. What you can do is change dramatically because of the core.
Exactly. Absolutely. That was the whole point behind bringing this to market, and I hope that the users find that we deliver on that.
Yep, absolutely. With no more ado, I think we can wrap this up. And I really appreciate, gentlemen, you guys going through it. Again, if folks would like to go to castlehillsoftware.com, they can take a look at the different capabilities. The explainer video is up there as well, the one we played at the very beginning of this, if folks want a refresher from that side. This will be out there as a recording for folks to reference, and also we'll be following up with the folks who have attended, just to provide them with that 1/3 off order, 1/3 off offer on the Estrelica.Core. There's also, I should mention, a 30-day trial license that can be downloaded as well, and we can work through any of those things with folks, and have a great day. Thanks again, gentlemen.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, Pete.
Bye all.